All right, let's get started. Anybody have any questions so far about anything to this point? No questions. All right, we're gonna spend the next 2 weeks on contract law. You're only gonna have one assignment for this unit, and it will be assigned, go live next week. So you don't have any assignments this week. You do have 2 cases to read for Thursday's class. They're posted already. It's the Wright versus Newman case and the Lucy versus Zimmer case. They're not very long. Be sure you've read those for Thursday's class. They will be on your assignment. It's just the assignment won't be till the next week. I'm gonna lecture most of today and a little bit on Thursday, and we'll have some Thursday discussion on those cases. And then we'll go into next week. Yes, sir.
Would you say it's usually like every other week, so assignment, non-assignment, assignment, or is this a special week?
The question is this a normal, was every other week be an assignment? The answer to that is generally, we're gonna have something every week. Because most of the units are gonna be 1 week at a time. It's just that contract law is there's a lot, and we need 2 weeks to cover contracts. So that's a good question. But for this 2 weeks, you'll just have one assignment. You do have a discussion question that is due next Monday. I did post one of those for this week, so make sure you look at that. I think this is clear by now, but I just want to reiterate, because somebody asked, and it was a great question. The assignments are open note, open material. It's not open internet, but it's open anything that I've posted as content for this class, and any notes that you take, you can use those on any of my assignments. They are designed for this, that's how we should work. All right, I want to, I'm gonna answer one of your Ask a Lawyer questions. I'm gonna try to do that at the beginning of every class. And I know which one I'll answer if y'all don't have a preference, but does anybody just have a burning question and they want me to answer their question first? Nobody? All right. Nobody, you did have, okay, Hudson, go ahead.
Are you talking about the discussion where it just ask the lawyer question?
Yep.
Okay. So the Supreme Court through its time has had a good amount of controversial decisions.
Okay.
Which one do you think was the most controversial that they've made or that caused the most uproar?
All right, so the question is from my online folks. What do I think is one of the most controversial Supreme Court decisions? Gosh, that's a great question. I mean, obviously something that's topical right now is the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And again, we're not going to debate that in here, but and I don't know that, I mean, I guess it's controversial. It's divisive. That's, I guess, the best way I would put that. And most Supreme Court cases don't make the news. I mean, we really don't, we don't have conversation on the street today and say, hey, what do you think about what the Supreme Court's done this year? I mean, you'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? I'll look at that. So when something big happens, we know about it. So in the last few years, we've had marriage equality. Was a Supreme Court decision. We've had the Roe versus Wade overturning. I think that one of the, I guess it depends on how you phrase your question, right? Controversial decision, important decision, impactful decision, depends on how you would define those. But certainly I think the civil rights cases in the 1960s were huge in terms of establishing equality in employment and some of the other employment discrimination, some of the other areas that came out of that. I'm biased, I guess, towards recency because of my lifetime. I mean, I'm more aware of what the court's done, you know, in the 50 years I've been alive than I was back when the court first started. But I would say those, are the most important. And then also I would highlight the ones that have increased our right to privacy. As we've built that up over the years, the Supreme Court has built up our right to privacy. I think those have been important. But I think reproductive rights, civil rights, those type of things are huge. What do you guys think? Or let me ask a different way. Would you guys say that, what would you say is a Supreme Court case that has made an impact on you, or that you're particularly interested in? I mean, if it's none of them, that's a good answer too. I'm curious to know. Do you care? Do you pay attention? Can anybody say?
I think that it was really like, I think one of the Supreme Court decisions I felt that was really important was Brown versus the Board of Education.
That's a huge
I think
one.
that affects us today.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. And now having studied that or thought about that in the last 2 weeks, not that you've never heard of it, but you know, now that you
Actually went.
are aware of it, you can see how that has impacted our lives from that point forward. Sure. So there are probably a lot of Supreme Court cases out there that are impactful that, you know, that I'm not aware of, that you're not aware of in your everyday life. Anybody have any other comment on Supreme Court cases? Nobody? Okay, that's a great question, Hudson. I like that question, did you? I'll continue to address those as we go. I read all your questions, they're very good, so we'll have some interesting things to talk about. All right, today we're going to talk about contract law. What makes a contract? What are the elements of a contract? I'm going to talk about some general overarching principles first. Make sure I cut that off. In general, courts will let people enter into whatever kind of contracts they want to, as long as they're legal. In general, the courts will not get into whether or not a contract was a good or a bad deal for somebody. Part of our freedom is the freedom to enter into contracts that we want to. So the general rule is that if I agree to it, I'm going to be bound by it. So that's one general rule. Another general rule is that a misconception people have at the beginning often in contract law is, well, a contract has to be in writing or else it's not enforceable. That's not true. There are some contracts that have to be in writing, yes. But it is not an overall rule that a contract has to be in writing in order to be enforceable. So, we could have enforceable, valid oral contracts. We could have enforceable, valid contracts that aren't based on writing or speaking, that are based on actions. If Noah comes down here and holds up a $5 bill to me and points at my Coke, and I point at that Coke, and he nods, and I nod, and I point at the $5 bill, he hands me the $5 bill, I hand him my Coke, that's contract. We spoke no words, all actions. So again, not every contract has to be in writing. Some do. I'm not trying to get you to learn in this class which ones do and which ones don't. We do get into that a little bit next week. What I want you to know is that my actions or my words could end up binding me into an enforceable contract. And what I write, obviously. But also what I say and what I do or what I don't do. So that's overarching principle number 2. Another overarching principle that I'd like for you to appreciate about contract law is that when you really get down to it, what we're worried about is whether or not a contract is enforceable or not. We might have a valid contract, but it might not be worth it for us to enforce it. If Noah gave me the $5 and I gave him my coat, and I went and took my coat back from him and gave him his $5 back, we have an enforceable contract. Is he going to actually sue me for that? I mean, he could, but it'd be a waste of time and money. So the question is not just do we have a valid contract, but I want you to think in your mind, business people, is this something that's enforceable? Am I actually going to be able to go to court and enforce this? Here's an example of that. I agree to sell Miss Leggett my car I offer to sell her my car for $30,000 and she accepts. This happens in the hallway outside of class. No one else heard it. I want you to assume for a second that my offer was valid and her acceptance was valid. Assume that we have a valid contract for the sale of my car, a valid verbal contract. But the only evidence of the contract is what I said and what she said, and nobody else heard that. What's my problem? How am I going to enforce that? Right? Because I could take her to court, she'd take me to court, and I could say, I didn't say that. Prove it. And she's still got to prove that that's what I said, and I've still got to prove that what she said was what she actually said. So we had a valid contract, but is it enforceable? So I want you to think in terms of a practical matter. Can I enforce this? That's just another overarching thing I want you to think of throughout this. Another overarching principle is that when courts are deciding contract disputes, they use what's called the objective theory of contracts. And what that means is that if there's a dispute about what a contract meant or whether there was a contract at all, or about any of the terms of the contract, in making a decision, the court is only going to base a decision on objective evidence. What was said, that can be proven. What was written, what the conduct was, what body language was, what the tone of words was. Those are all objective things that we could testify to or show evidence of. What a court will not get into is what somebody subjectively thought. Yeah, I know I told you, Ben, I was selling you my white horse, but I was just confused. I meant that I was selling you my brown horse. But we wrote in our written contract, I'm selling you the white horse. Or I made an offer to you, I will sell you my white horse, and everybody heard it. I said white horse. I can't go to court and say, Judge, I know I said white horse, but I've just been so confused lately. I didn't sleep well. I'm so sorry. But I meant the brown horse. Not that won't fly. The courts are only going to be able to make a decision based on objective facts. And that should make sense to you. In the business world, we don't want contracts to be unenforceable because somebody could go to court and say that's not what they meant. Or that's not what they were thinking. Business would crumble if you could get out of anything if you did that. So courts use the objective theory of contracts. What did you say? How did you say it? What did you write? What actions did you take? Or not take? not what you were thinking inside or what you meant or what you assumed. Objective theory of contracts. So, when you're thinking about whether or not you have a contract that you can actually enforce in court, your mind should go to, okay, if I've got to go to court, what objective evidence do I have to prove to the court what was said, written, or done? You can have a valid contract all day long, but if you're going to have trouble enforcing it, it's not worth much to you. Which brings me to the last overarching principle of contract law that I want to tell you. It's not really a principle of contract law, it's just common sense. It's advice. Just because you don't have to put some contracts in writing doesn't mean you shouldn't. Always, 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 always get it in writing. Always get it in writing. If for some reason you didn't, you'll remember Professor Tebow taught me I still might have a valid enforceable contract based on verbal interaction or body language or actions. But I should be very reluctant to rely on that. If something is important enough to enter into a contract for, it's important enough to get it all in writing in case you have a dispute over that. Always, always put it in writing if you can. So with those general ideas in mind, let's look at some specifics of contracts. In section E of your outline, under section 1, subpart E, that's where I am. Elements of a contract. The elements of an enforceable contract, there are 4 of them. 2 of them we're going to do this week, 2 next week. But just to build the overall picture for you, they are these. Agreement is an essential element of any contract. Consideration. We're going to get in depth into these, so I'm just naming them for you right now. Capacity. We got to have the capacity, we have the ability to enter into a contract. And then legality. It has to be legal. So agreement, consideration, capacity, and legality. This week we're taking on agreement and consideration. So let's go to agreement, section 2. First part of an agreement is there has to be an offer. Before you can have an acceptance, before you can have any sort of agreement, one party has to make an offer to the other party. The offeror is the one who makes the offer. The offeree would be the one who the offer is made to. Okay, we break offer down into some subparts. And those are these. An offer has to express serious intent. It has to be reasonably certain or definite in its terms. Because again, if you're going to enforce it in a court, you're going to need to be able to go in and show the court with reasonable certainty what it was about. If it's too ambiguous, the flip side of that is if it's too ambiguous, then it may not constitute an offer. And then it has to be communicated to the offeree. So if I offer Miss Houston specifically, I will sell you my car, Miss Houston, for $30,000. Okay? And another student says, you got a deal, and brings me $30,000. I didn't communicate that offer. That was not made to anybody else but Miss Houston. Now, if I said to you, I'll offer to sell anybody in this class my car, $30,000. I've communicated that. I've got a I got a big pool of people I've made an offer to now. But it has to be communicated to the offeree. Now, when courts, this is another, I'm gonna, not going off topic, but I'm gonna go big picture for a minute for you. Not just in contract law, but in other areas of the law. In a courtroom, when we're trying to decide whether or not something was reasonable, we use something called the reasonable person standard. Okay? What would a reasonable person in the same circumstances, what is it reasonable for them to expect? So, if we're trying to determine whether I made an offer to everybody in the class, and I said, I will offer to sell any of you my car, and we have a dispute about whether or not I made that offer to you or not, the court's going to say, would a reasonable person sitting in your seat have understood what I said to mean that I was offering my car for sale to anybody in here? Probably so. Any of you, what would a reasonable person take that to mean? Right. I mean, but it's not a bright line test. There's no formula in the law for it. And this can be exhausting to some people. Some people love this about the law. We can always argue both sides. There's this huge gray area. It's fascinating. I love it. And others are like, this wears me out. There's an exception to everything. What is reasonable? Oh my God, I'm going to pull my hair out. Now we're going to have to determine what is reasonable, what I think is reasonable versus what you think is reasonable versus what you think is reasonable. Exhausting. I fall in both camps. I'm interested in the law, became interested in it because it does fascinate me in some areas, but I will say that there are certainly areas of it that just wears you out. It'd be nice if there was just numbers sometimes to plug into the calculator and have the answer spit out for us. But this is not that class. So if we're going to go back and talk about an offer for a second and whether or not there was serious intent. When might we not have serious intent? Well, an expression of opinion is not considered to be serious intent to make an offer. I think I would like to sell my car, or I think I would like to sell my car for what it's worth. I think my car is worth $50,000. Ben brings me a check for $50,000. Did I make him an offer? I just expressed an opinion of what I thought my car was worth. We get into a dispute about whether or not that was an offer, then the court's going to say, would a reasonable person in Ben's shoes have understood me saying I think my car's worth $50,000 to be an offer for him to buy it for that amount? I think most of us would agree, hopefully, that a reasonable person would say that's not an offer. You just told me what you thought your car was worth. You didn't say anything about selling it. So an expression of opinion is not a definite offer. Does not express serious intent. Similar to that, statements of future intent aren't offers. I'm going to sell my house next year for $1 million. Next year, Mr. Thames brings me a check for $1 million. You got $1 million, don't you? He brings me a check for $1 million and says, I accept your deal. I just said I was going to sell it next year. So statements of future intent are not sufficient to make an offer. Similarly, preliminary negotiations are not. hey, Professor Tebow, would you be willing to sell your car? Yeah, I might be willing to sell my car. How much? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I paid $30,000 for it. I'd like to get at least what's owed on it. How much is owed on it? I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe I still owe $20,000 on it. Are you thinking cash or are you thinking financing? I'm thinking I would rather have a cash offer. You know, that's my feeling on it. And then the next day, one of you or whoever I'm negotiating with brings me a check for $20,000 and says, "Here, we have the." Now, is it conceivable that the parties could have different ideas about at what point the preliminary negotiations became an offer? Yeah. We have disputes about that all the time. The courtrooms are full of people. We disagree about a lot of things. So, generally speaking, preliminary negotiations are not an offer. But your legal rabbit ears should be going up if you're learning anything so far. And you should be thinking, yeah, but I need to be really worried about at what point my negotiations became an offer. I need to be very careful about it. Advertisements are not offers. So just because I saw that I could buy one, get one free of Pop-Tarts at CVS in their newspaper ad, that does not constitute an offer in terms of making an enforceable contract. And that's a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, we want to be able to, we don't like the idea that vendors can't honor what they've advertised. Yes, sir.
So say that does happen, like they advertise that and they don't end up doing that. At what point does that lie under false advertising?
At what point does that lie under false advertising is the question. So, while an advertisement is not an offer, it can't be fraudulent. So, but those are two different things. That's a great question. It doesn't mean that advertisers have license to just say anything they want. But it does mean that we can't hold them to an enforceable contract based on their advertisement. Question, Mr. Freeman?
What happens if, like, say you're paying this room, you're doing like square foot price, 59 cents square foot, okay? And like you get the job, but after the job, you go up on the price, say it's like 62 cents a square foot.
So the question is, what happens if a term gets changed during the job? And I think the example was, a quote was 59 cents per square foot, and at the end of the job, the person wants to charge 62 cents per square foot. It would go back to did you have an offer that was definite, and did you have an acceptance at the beginning about what the price was? You can't just change things. So you couldn't use an advertisement to change the terms of a deal midstream. Is that what you're kind of thinking of? Yeah, you can't do that. So generally speaking, ads are not offers. All right, so we've covered serious intent, we've covered communication to the offeror. Skipped over definiteness. Let's get into definiteness a little bit. The offer needs to identify the parties with reasonable certainty. If I make an offer and say to any student, I'll sell my car to any student in this class for $30,000. I've identified the parties. It would be me and one of y'all. But if I said to you, I'm going to sell I'll sell my car for $30,000 to you up there with the brown hair. That's not definite enough for us to determine who I made the offer to. So we gotta be able to identify the parties. We need to have some sort of identification of the subject matter or the terms of the deal, price, delivery, payment, all those things. We need to have some specification in that. Let's say that Caroline and I enter into a contract, and I say I will agree to pay her $5,000 for professional services. Is that definite enough? And you could argue that both ways, right? Or it depends on the other facts. If she's an accountant, and I met with her in her office after we had discussed 2 hours of my tax issue, and the offer was that I'll pay you $5,000 for your professional services, context might provide enough definiteness that what we meant was her services as an accountant. But let's just say she's a student, not just a student. She is a student, but with no degrees, no training, no job. What in the world do we mean by professional services? That's subject to interpretation. So it might not be definite enough. All right. When does an offer terminate? If I make an offer, can I take it back? So let me give you some examples. Let's stick with the car example. And let's say that I offer to sell Miss King my car for $30,000. And I tell her she's got until Friday. You can let me know by Friday. And Wednesday comes, and I haven't heard anything from her. But I see her in class, and I say, hey, by the way, I know I offered you to sell you my car, but I'm revoking that offer. Can I do that? Let's break it down even more. Pretend I didn't say I'd leave it open until Friday. I just said I'll sell you my car for $30,000. And then on Thursday in class, I tell her, I'll revoke that offer. That's not on the table anymore. Take it off the table. Can I do that? Absolutely. I can do that. If I make an offer, I can revoke it. What if I tell her in my original example where I said, I'll give you till Friday, and Thursday rolls around and I revoke my offer? Can I do that even though I told her I'd leave it open till Friday?
Yes.
I can do that.
Nothing was agreed upon.
Nothing was agreed upon. She did not accept my offer. Now, there are situations where you do have to keep an offer open, but those are when you get paid to keep an offer open. We see those in real estate contracts, option contracts. But there has to be some sort of consideration given for keeping it open. We could put it in writing that I'm going to leave it open till Friday. But if she hasn't given me anything of value in exchange for me leaving it open till Friday, I could revoke it. But if I say, I'll sell you my car for $30,000 and I'll leave the offer open till Friday if you pay me $10, then I've agreed to I've given up something of value. She's given me something of value in exchange for that, keeping it open. So unless there's been a payment to secure a time period of an offer being open, it can be revoked before the end of the time period. What happens if I say to Miss King, I will sell you my car for $30,000, and she says no. And then the next morning, the next class, she comes in and says, change my mind, here's $30,000. Now you have to sell me your car. What about that? Is that gonna be a valid acceptance of my offer? Why not?
It's already rejected.
The offer terminated when she rejected it. When she said no, the offer ended. What about if she says to me, if I say to her, I will sell you my car for $30,000, and she says, I won't buy it for $30,000, but I'll buy it for $20,000. And I shake my head and I say no. And she says, okay, I'll buy it for $30,000. And I say, too bad. Offer was revoked. Am I right?
Yeah.
What actually happened there?
When she declined the first one, they knew it was an entire new offer.
That's right, Hudson. When she said no to my offer, that revoked my offer. But when she said, I'll give you $20,000 for it, now what do we have? A new offer. Now she's the offeror and I'm the offeree. So every time you make a counter offer, you have terminated the previous offer and you made a new one. Can't go backwards. Now, that doesn't mean if she says, okay, I'll give you $30,000 for it, and I say, okay, that's fine, we got a deal. It just means that I wouldn't have to accept, or I wouldn't be bound to that. So counter offers terminate the original offer and result in a new offer. Offers could also be terminated if, and I want you to be familiar with these general concepts, and I'm not gonna get into, we're not gonna get this nitty gritty, but if the subject matter of the contract was destroyed, if I totaled my car on the way to school Thursday morning before Miss King accepted my offer and she comes in with a check, my offer would be deemed to have been terminated because I can't sell her a car that doesn't exist. If a person dies before an offer is accepted, most of the time that will terminate an offer. Or if a person becomes incapacitated, that will terminate an offer. Again, that's only terminating an offer. If there's been an acceptance and we have a contract, then that's a whole different story. We're just talking about an offer. Hudson?
That would be just.
That was it, it's okay. If I tell Ms. King that I will sell her my car for $30,000 and she has to answer me by Friday, and Friday comes and goes and she has not answered, my offer's terminated. So it could terminate by time running out. All right. A point to remember in this also is that when an offer is considered terminated, or when an offer is considered received, or by that same token, when acceptance is given, it is deemed to be received, either offer or acceptance, when the person received it. So let's, for example, say that I offer to sell Amanda my car for $30,000. And I tell her I'll leave the offer open until Friday. But tomorrow I email her and I revoke my offer. But she never got the email. I have not effectively or legally revoked that offer until she gets it. Same thing for acceptance. Well, that's not true. We're just talking about offers. throw a curveball to you on acceptance, but I'm not gonna do that yet. So, it's deemed to be it's deemed to be made, an offer is deemed to be made or offer is deemed to be revoked when that offer or revocation was received. All right, there's, in this 2 weeks, in this class, we're getting into basic foundations of contract law so that you can understand contract law principles. In the real world, not that we're not in the real world, in today's business world, it's not as complicated as I'm making it out to be. We're studying contract law from the idea that, well, let me put it a different way. There is something called the Uniform Commercial Code. Anybody heard of the UCC, Uniform Commercial Code? All right, and what it is it's a uniform set of laws regarding contracts for the sale of goods, so business-related contracts. And each of the 50 states has adopted the Uniform Commercial Code. So all 50 states have the same law when it comes to the sale of goods over $500. We don't get into that in this class because the UCC is, it's a class in and of itself. I do want you to know that it exists, and that should give you some comfort that the business world is not as unpredictable and chaotic as I'm making it sound like when it comes to contracts. There is a lot of certainty and there's a lot of uniformity provided by the Uniform Commercial Code. So in this class, we're sort of assuming that everything we talk about is not covered by the UCC. When in reality, most of the stuff that most contracts for the sale of goods, that takes a pretty large slice of the pie. But not everything. I mean, that would not cover sale of land, sale of a house. Might not cover the sale of a car between private individuals. It would cover the sale of cars from a dealership, sale of goods. But just know that is something that's out there. All right, let's get into acceptance. So acceptance needs to be communicated to the offeror. Ordinarily, silence is not acceptance. So I can't say, Troy, I'm offering to sell you my house for $1 million. And if you don't say anything, that means you agree. Generally, silence is not acceptance. When might silence constitute acceptance? If my body language was such that a reasonable person who saw it, heard it, watched it, would conclude that my silence was agreement. I mean, it could happen. It's not common. It's going to be unusual for silence to be a valid acceptance.
Nod your head, shake his hand, but you don't say you accept it.
Right. Maybe if I nodded my head. Yeah, don't confuse silence with just not speaking. I think I mean silence in terms of no action at all. Certainly, body language, nodding, speaking, shaking hands, those would not necessarily equate with silence, even though you're not speaking. But you can't be bound to a contract just because you didn't respond to an offer. But because contracts can be implied by actions, it's conceivable. I could conceive of a situation where silence might be. But generally speaking, silence is not acceptance. Now, if you want to leave no doubt, don't be silent, say no. Not no, but hell no. No, thank you. Right? Don't leave doubt. Back to the reasonable person standard for a second, and why it's important to think about how your evidence would look to a court objectively is that if I say to Hudson, I'll sell you my car for $30,000, and he says, okay. If you read a transcript of our conversation, it would read like this. Hey Hudson, I'll sell you my car for $30,000. Hudson, okay. But what if his okay was, okay. Okay. Would a reasonable person who saw that exchange have interpreted that to be an acceptance? Not so much. Not as black and white as it is when you just read it. Read a transcript of our conversation. So that's why the objective theory takes into account not just words, but actions, body language, tone of voice, all those other things that might indicate to a person who objectively observed what the person was or wasn't agreed to.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when somebody is being read their Miranda rights, is that what is that classified as?
Okay, when somebody's been read their Miranda rights, that is that you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney. That's when a person gets arrested, they get read their Miranda rights. That's just a requirement of criminal procedure. You have to be read your Miranda rights. If you're not, then your charges could be thrown out. They can be dismissed if you weren't read your rights. So it's not the same as a contract. There's actually a law that says that you have to be read those rights when you get arrested.
I was thinking it was a contract, but then you're talking about remaining silent.
Yeah.
I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, she was thinking that in terms of remaining silent, right? Yeah, there's no contract going on there. And the reason there's no contract going on there is the element that we're going to study Thursday, and talk about a little bit today, which is consideration. Each party has to give up something of value. If I tell you you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to remain silent. I mean, you haven't made any promises to me to secure your right to remain silent. You haven't done anything for that. Each party has to give up something of value. And by that, I don't necessarily mean exchange money. When CSU fired me for being old and I sued them, we might have come to an agreement in a contract that our settlement to the lawsuit is a contract. We will pay you $5 million in exchange for you not suing us. You give up your right to sue us. And maybe we'll throw in that you can't talk about it. You can't tell anybody that we paid you $5 million. They've given up $5 million. I gave up the right to sue, and I gave up the right to tell anybody that I got $5 million for it. That's consideration. A promise to do something in exchange for a promise to do something or not do something. Promise could be for payment. Promise could be to refrain from certain conduct. Promise could be for performance or conduct. Something for something. Now, I mentioned to you at the beginning of class that courts generally don't get into whether you made a bad deal or not. So courts do not care so much about the adequacy of consideration. If I say that I will sell you my car for $10,000 and it's worth $50,000, Parker, and you brought me the $10,000, and I told you that I changed my mind, I mean, I can't sell you my car for $10,000. It's worth $50,000. Why would I go through with that? The court's going to say that's too bad. We're not going to get into why you might have. Maybe I needed $10,000 to pay off my bookie, so he didn't break my legs or kill my dog. And I was desperate for $10,000 a night, so it would have been worth it for me that day to get that $10,000. Courts are just not going to get into that. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have consumer protections from unfair power or somebody exerting undue influence over another. If there was a great discrepancy in leverage or knowledge or power, if that dynamic is off, then a court might negate the consideration, might negate the contract. So if there was something that was inherently unfair about it, then it might not be sufficient. But if it's just a bad deal, or I have buyer's remorse or seller's remorse, that isn't going to be enough to negate it. Yes?
Say in a situation, one of the parties is not of right mind, a healthy mind, would that negate the contract with the court?
So the question is, if one party was not in their right mind, would that negate the contract? That goes to the element of capacity, the third element of a contract, and that's for next week. But yes, it could. It very well could. Very well could negate it. So again, generally, you made a bad deal, the court's going to enforce that. Because again, the opposite is, if everybody wanted to get out of a deal because later on they decided it was a bad deal, business would crumble. We can't operate on a system like that.
So what's an example of a unfair deal or something that's
An unfair deal. Let's say that I'm a door-to-door salesman and I knock on the door of a 95-year-old man, and he has capacity. He doesn't have any mental illness or anything like that. But I'm real smooth talking and fast talking, and I showed him a 20-page contract that was written in 5-point type, and I didn't really give him time to read it. He wanted to run it by his children, but I kind of pressured him into doing it. That might be unfair power dynamic. Or that person felt threatened. I mean, obviously anything that's overtly a threat would negate voluntariness as well. You better, one of the scams is your grandson's in prison in Panama and needs $10,000 to get out on bail. That might not be voluntary if you feel like you're under pressure to do something. Maybe Parker knows that I have big gambling debt, and he makes me an offer to buy my car for a lot less than it's worth because he knows I'm in a bad spot. I mean, probably still valid. Maybe unless the bookie is getting ready to break my legs right then, or maybe I'm under so much pressure that a reasonable person would not be able to think clearly under the circumstances. But generally speaking, bad deals are still enforceable. All right, so consideration. Let me see what we got left on that. I think I can finish consideration. So when might we have a lack of consideration? When might we have a lack of consideration? Well, a gift is a lack of consideration. I'm gonna give Chasen $5,000. But then next week, he's like, hey, professor, where's that $5,000 you promised me? And I tell him I changed my mind. The problem in enforcing that as a contract is there was no consideration. He didn't give up anything. No consideration. So a gift would not be considered a binding contract. If I already have the duty to do something legally, then me promising to do that in exchange for something from you is not consideration. So for example, I have a duty to drive my car safely on University Avenue. But I tell Miss Blum, you know, I pull out of here every day after class behind you. You pay me $10, then I won't rear end your car. I won't tailgate you. I won't cut you off. I already have a duty to do that. I mean, I'm already legally there. That's a silly example. If this goes to your question, Chasen, from a little while ago, what if in our agreement, I've agreed to pay you 59 cents a square foot for a material. And then later on, you say, well, you know, it's really gonna cost me 61 cents per square foot. Will you pay me that? And I say yes. Well, that's not new consideration. That's something he was already bound to do, is to sell it to me for 59 cents a foot by our contract. So you can't just hijack a deal in the middle of it and ask for something more without getting something back in exchange. If he said to me, you know, construction costs have gone up since we entered that agreement, if you'll pay 61 cents a square foot, then I will substitute a higher grade material. That's consideration. Now I've agreed to pay more, but he's also agreed to substitute a higher grade material. We both gave up something.
So that's a new contract?
No, well,
Or,
the question is that a new contract? It could be. It could be, it's binding, I guess is the best way to do it. The reason I'm being squirrely about that answer is, sometimes you can rip up an old contract and just say this is our new agreement, but you could also amend an existing contract in certain ways. So the question really is that binding? And the answer is yeah. The answer is generally yeah. All right, so in this class, this hasn't really happened today. It happened a couple times. But the best questions in this class start with what if. In my 8 o'clock class, I didn't get this far in the lecture because we have a bunch of what ifs. And there's only 12 of them. So don't be afraid to raise your hand and say, what if? That's how we illustrate everything we're learning. What if? Best questions in this class start with what if. The best answers in this class start with it depends. It depends. You know, I can argue it both ways. Depends on some other facts. Depends on all facts. Another agreement that lacks consideration is a promise that's illusory. And what I mean by that, what the law means by that is it's not definite enough. So let's say that I tell my employees that they will get paid a bonus at the end of the year in exchange for all their hard work if we do well. I mean, what does if we do well mean? That might be an illusory promise. Again, your rabbit ear should go up. It depends. What if we've gotten a bonus every single year that the company has made a profit, no matter whether it was a profit of $1 or a profit of $1 million? If I say we do well, am I going to be bound by that at the end of the year? Maybe. Depends. Probably not, but it could depend on past conduct, past other actions that I've made. Yes, sir. Would that be the same if there was a quota? I think a quota would not be illusory, because the opposite of illusory would be something that's concrete and real, that's measurable. So if I've made any kind of offer, or if the consideration is I pay you a bonus if you have manufactured a certain number of items, or you've sold a certain number of items, that's not illusory. That's determinable. That's concrete. That is consideration. But an illusory promise is one that we just really can't pin down what the consideration would actually be. So, to review real quick, overarching ideas from the first two elements of contracting. Not every contract has to be in writing. We can have verbal contracts, we can have implied contracts by conduct. A main question in contract law is this contract enforceable? You can have a valid contract, but is it going to be enforceable in court? That's what really matters to you. It's not worth it to you if it's not enforceable in court. We judge evidence in a contract dispute by the objective theory of contracts. What it was said, what actions were taken, what tone of voice was used, what was written, what actions weren't taken, body language, the objective theory of the contract, not by what somebody was thinking or what somebody meant or thought they meant. The objective theory of contracts is how we measure all this. Those are the general takeaways that I want y'all to have for today. On Thursday, I got a little bit more that I want to talk about on consideration, and then we're going to get into the Wright versus Newman case and the Lucy versus Zemer case. And then I want you to come prepared with any what-if questions that you have. See y'all Thursday.